Policy Brief from PIIE, for inflation relief, the United States should look to trade liberalization. This is co-authored by Gary Huffbauer, Megan Hogan, and Yilin Wang. And I think it is not just topical and important, but well done. An example of the kind of data work that Gary has been leading for years and that Meg and Yilin have been able to enable for us in recent times. We will also be joined by our board vice chair, Lauren Summers, the former US Secretary of the Treasury, who has been a leading voice on the issues of inflation and has encouraged us, frankly, in our work on how tariffs might matter for reducing inflation in the US. Before we turn to my colleagues' remarks, though, I just want to say two things of context. We have also released a short summary of a more detailed study by our colleagues Sherman Robinson and Karen Felder. They are experts in computable general equilibrium modeling, and they addressed from a different perspective the same question that Gary, Meg, and Yilin have, which is how much would tariff reduction improve or reduce inflation in the US? And what's important about their perspective is that they work with very complicated input-output tables and are able to look at sectoral perspectives. So whereas the policy brief we're about to present is in a sense top-down, the work by Sherman and Karen is bottom-up. And it therefore takes very seriously the arguments about short-term shortages and gives you a sense of scale of why a reduction in particular, they go through the exercise with steel and other metal tariffs, why that would make a big difference. And they end up with a figure, frankly, that's relatively close in magnitude and significant compared, similar to what Megan, Yilin, and Gary do. So I would encourage all our viewers and our friends who view this later to read both the policy brief by Gary, Megan, Yilin, and the summary of the study, and there's a lot of background to it, by Sherman and Karen, both of which are available on the PIIE website. The second point I wanted to make is just a point of substantive introduction. There is a long tradition in Washington, and I think in most policymaking spheres, that when you have a problem, you try to justify whatever policy you've always been in favor of as a solution to that problem. And this is something people joke about on Twitter, but it's long predates that. And so there may be people out there who say, well, the Peterson Institute always wants trade liberalization, so now they're saying it's good for inflation. And I can't preempt people thinking that way, but I think it's important to make 2 points related to that. The first is that unlike some other things, such as corporate concentration in various industries, which may be worth dealing with, tariffs really are directly about prices and inflation and consumer pocketbooks. And therefore, this is an important aspect. Welcome, Larry. Thank you for joining us. This is an important aspect of dealing with a problem, particularly when we're talking about shortages of various goods and services. And so it is not just a reach of, oh, Peterson Institute always wants tariff reduction. It is directly relevant. The second point, and this gets into things that I expect Larry will talk about in his remarks in the second half of the presentation, is that we're at a very critical time. We can go into, and Peterson Institute publications and discussions have, how much of a mistake the Fed made when they should have recognized inflation was more than just transitory sectoral factors, when it became a labor market issue and so on. But the bottom line is we are at 40-year highs of inflation. We are still at relatively loose monetary policy settings, and we are still, in today's data as seen, facing a real inflation problem. And we know from history, to which the US is not exempted, that high inflation can be politically destabilizing. And we live in a context where the shadow of January 6th last year remains with us. So I think it is important, as a former central banker, you usually say it's a one-time price shock. Yes, tariffs can affect inflation, but why does it matter? I think it's important to recognize in the current context, taking off some of the toppiness of inflation both may practically help the Fed get inflation down because it helps drive down the momentum and potentially the expectations, but also because inflation at this high level at this juncture is potentially so politically devastating for any country. So with those things in mind, I'm going to first turn to Gary, Meg, and Yilin to present, and then we'll turn to Larry to give us his thoughts on tariffs and inflation in the broader context of macro policymaking. First, just to say, Gary Hufbauer was for several decades the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute. A couple of years ago, too much crying and rending of garments by the Peterson staff, he decided to cut back on his amount of time and is now a non-resident senior fellow. But Gary continues to be an incredibly intellectually vibrant and wonderful colleague and contributor. Importantly, Gary has also served, of course, at the US Treasury, is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax, and has served at the Council on Foreign Relations as Director on Studies. Gary's one of many, many publications by Gary was the legendary Big Number of how much globalization benefited American consumers and households. And so we're in that spirit, we're happy to have his big number on inflation. Working with Gary are two rising stars. We're very proud to have as young analysts at the Peterson Institute, young in professional terms, but they're obviously very well equipped. Megan Hogan is working with Gary and Jeff Schott on trade issues. She, among her other accomplishments when she was at William and Mary, she managed to create a new disinfo lab, I believe it was called, very timely and very data intensive, which was worth creating. We also have, as a co-author on this policy brief, Yilin Wang, who works with Gary's successor as the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow, Chad Bown, on international trade law and institutions. She previously worked at our friends on the other side of the policy street, Center for Strategic and International Studies, and previously spent time in Shenzhen working as a research associate at the School of Management and Economics there. With that, let me turn to Gary, Meg, and Yilin in that order, and then we'll come back to former Secretary Summers. Gary.
Well, thank you, Adam. As you said, 7% inflation inflicts quite severe pain on households and threatens political upheaval in November. Putin's war has added soaring energy and food prices to underlying inflationary pressures and now new defense spending. Trade protection implemented by President Trump curtailed competition in the American economy. It created unnecessary shortages, and it, of course, inflicted higher prices on households. In this context, as you said, Adam, Larry Summers prompted us to examine the constructive role of trade liberalization in reducing inflation. Briefly, we reach two findings. First, a 2 percentage point tariff reduction equivalent in trade barriers, that's a modest but a feasible package, could deliver a one-time reduction in consumer price index inflation of about 1.3 percentage points. And that reduction, that number may sound small, but that reduction would amount to almost $800 per US household. And that's roughly half the size of pandemic relief that was voted by Congress in 2021. Now, more ambitiously, if all the specific tariff reduction measures proposed in our policy brief that Megan and Yilin will outline were implemented, if they are all implemented, they could deliver a 4 percentage point of tariff equivalent liberalization and reduce consumer price index inflation by as much as 2 percentage points in the longer term. Now, as you said, Adam, while our calculations are truly back of the envelope, together with the work that Sherman and Karen have done, they should really encourage serious consideration of trade liberalization by President Biden and the Congress. My colleagues, Megan Hogan and Yilin Wang, will now explain how we put together an agenda of trade liberalization that would reverse the recent protection and meaningfully curb inflationary pressures. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Elin, could you share your screen? Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone. So current inflation in the United States is higher than it has been at any point in 40 years. And to contain inflation, the Federal Reserve plans to raise interest rates in the coming months, making money more expensive to borrow and spend. And as higher interest rates contain price increases by slowing hiring, wage growth, and demand, inflation is a major liability for the Biden administration, one that the president does not take lightly. During his State of the Union address at the beginning of this month, President Biden repeatedly called inflation his top priority and identified a number of solutions to cool rapid price gains, including encouraging corporate competition, strengthening supply chains, and reducing and capping prescription drug prices. Corporate consolidation drives up prices for consumers and drives down wages for workers, as fewer firms in the market can charge higher markups for their products, and fewer employers in town imply fewer opportunities to bargain for higher wages. Ocean shipping costs have soared during the pandemic, and semiconductor shortages have driven up prices for finished products that use them, such as cars and consumer technology. Cutting the cost of prescription drugs, that is an ongoing push of the Biden administration, not necessarily relevant to Biden's inflation regulation campaign, but the cost of prescription drug prices is stretched back to the Build Back Better bill, which is currently on ice after failing to pass through the Senate last year. And while a lack of competition and high profits in the pharmaceutical and energy sector, among others, do likely contribute to high prices, trade liberalization measures are often overlooked by policymakers as a meaningful way to curtail inflation. Relaxing tariff duties would ease price increases hitting American consumers. Though recent research from PIIE non-resident senior fellow Catherine Russ suggests that US tariffs imposed specifically on imports from China only marginally raise costs for US consumers and firms, inflation can be meaningfully reduced if one considers a broader array of tariffs. If the White House takes this view seriously, we argue it should set itself a liberalization target equivalent to a 2 percentage point tariff reduction. Elin, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. To put this goal in context, the Trump administration imposed an additional 16% average tariff on $506 billion of imports from China, which equates to around $81 billion of higher costs for American consumers. In 2021, we estimate that over $610 billion of US imports were subject to high tariffs, penalty duties, or severe quotas. The $112 billion figure for anti-dumping and countervailing duties is based off of a 2022 working paper from PIIE Reginald Jones Senior Fellow Chad Bown, who found that 4.3% of US imports from G20 countries in 2019 were covered by anti-dumping or countervailing duties. To give a rough estimate for 2021 and for all US imports, we use 4% to multiply 2021 total US imports from the world. The $336 billion figure for Trump's trade war tariffs, that builds off of Bound's 2021 research tracking the US-China trade war, where he found that around 66.4% of US imports from China in 2017 were covered by the trade war tariff. So to roughly estimate this for 2021, we take US imports from China in 2021, $506 billion, and then multiply that by 66.4%. The $90 billion figure for Buy America is based off of remarks from President Biden during his State of the Union address, where he said that the federal government spends about $600 billion a year to keep the country safe and secure. So without Buy America, we estimate about 15% of that number would probably be imported. And for tariffs on Moroccan potash fertilizer, the last above the total, we estimate that around 15% of that number, with the Moroccan potash fertilizer, something to note is that there may be slight double counting between this policy and the first one in this table, so anti-dumping and countervailing duties. So all told, 2 percentage points of tariff equivalent relief on the $2,800 billion of US merchandise imports in 2021 would be equivalent to $56 billion in lower costs for Americans, as 2% of $2,800 billion is $56 billion. If President Trump can raise costs for average households by $81 billion, President Biden can at least lower those costs by $56 billion. As Elin will elucidate further on in this presentation, there's a long list of possible liberalization measures the Biden administration can employ, but each one faces a challenging battle from both vested interests and in Congress. The core message of our brief is that President Biden needs to assign the US Trade Representative, the Treasury, and the Council of Economic Advisors the task of assembling a package that meets our 2 percentage point goal. So as you see on this slide, US imports of goods amounted to $2.8 trillion in 2021. So a year when US GDP reached $23 trillion. So in other words, US imports composed roughly 12% of GDP in 2021. Unsurprisingly, imports also contributed to 12% of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. Lower import prices would quickly and directly reach consumers through lower prices at retail outlets. Think Amazon, Target, and Walmart. Other elements of trade liberalization would take longer to reach consumers as they reduce the cost of intermediate goods, which is the largest component of US imports, and gradually lower prices of finished goods delivered by US firms to American households. As the goal of trade liberalization, trade liberalization, 2 percentage point tariff equivalent liberalization eventually makes its way to consumer prices through a chain of intermediate transactions, the one-time impact would lower CPI inflation by about 0.25%. Elin, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So according to the Computable General Equilibrium, or CGE analysis of PIIE non-resident senior fellow Sherman Robinson and Karen Thierfelder of the US Naval Academy, when imports are highly interchangeable with domestically produced goods, CPI inflation would be reduced by 0.67 percentage point for each 1 percentage point decrease in tariff equivalent import barriers. In technical terms, this 0.67 percentage point reduction occurs when there's something called a high elasticity of substitution, with substitution meaning that less expensive imported goods compete with more expensive domestic goods, leading to a shift in purchasing patterns and putting pressure on prices charged for domestic goods. Increased competition may also compel domestic firms to trim their markup margins, especially in this era of high corporate profits. So based on the Robinson-Thierfelder coefficient, the competitive impact of a 2 percentage point decrease in tariff equivalent barriers could reduce CPI inflation by 1.34 percentage points, so 0.67 times 2 percentage points. From this figure, to avoid double counting, we subtract the 0.24 percentage point direct impact calculated on the previous slide, giving a 1.1 percentage point reduction in CPI inflation for the competitive effect. Elin? Thank you. Our back of the envelope calculations indicate that a 2 percentage point reduction in tariff equivalent barriers would deliver a one-time decrease in CPI inflation of 1.3 percentage points. So 0.2 percentage point plus 1.1 percentage points. While a 1.3 percentage point haircut might seem pretty small, especially when inflation is raging at more than 7%, the relief is not trivial. In more normal times, when CPI inflation is running at 2% annually, which is the Federal Reserve's target rate, a 1.3 percentage point one-time decrease would be quite noticeable. And moreover, since lower income households consume a larger proportion of their income than upper income households, trade liberalization counts as a progressive policy, right? In the same way that cutting a sales tax is a progressive policy. To make trade liberalization even more progressive, the Biden administration could target imported goods that figure more in lower income households' expenditures, things like school supplies, clothing, and furniture.
Sorry, Megan, I think it's time to shift to Yilin. Are we there?
Perfect timing. It is, yes, Yilin's next.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Megan. As Megan was discussing in this policy brief, we are aiming for a 2 percentage point tariff equivalent reduction. And now I'm going to talk about how we can possibly achieve that goal. In our policy brief, we considered 8 measures. And for each measure, we went through the following exercise to evaluate the effect of the measure on CPI inflation. First, we asked the question, how much money can this measure save for US consumers? And that is in terms of US dollar values. And then we calculate how much that saving is in terms of tariff equivalent reduction on all US goods imports. And finally, we translate that tariff equivalent reduction to CPI inflation reduction. The first measure we considered is eliminating Trump's trade war tariffs. During the US-China trade war, the Trump administration imposed on average 19% tariff on imports coming from China, which is 16% additional tariffs, on top of the 3% average MFN tariff rate the US imposes on the rest of the world. If these tariffs are removed, it will save US firms and households about $81 billion annually on direct purchases from China. That saving of $81 billion corresponds to a tariff equivalent reduction of 2.9 percentage points on all US goods imports. And then the second measure we considered is dismantling Trump's 25% Section 232 steel tariffs. These tariffs were first announced on March the 1st, 2018. And then in late March and the beginning of June, 2 rounds of steel tariffs went into effect, affecting 2 sets of trading partners. And some of them are US alliances such as the EU and Japan. As we can see from this chart on the left, since the time when these tariffs were imposed, which is the period shaded in the chart, steel price has more than doubled. Biden has replaced those tariffs with quotas, but that gives little relief to US steel using firms given the consistently high price. If these tariffs are removed, it will save American steel using firms $8.5 billion, or a tariff equivalent reduction of 0.3 percentage point on all US good imports. The third measure we considered is waiving the penalty duties on Canadian lumber. US and Canada have engaged in a 4-decade-long bilateral dispute. Last, US doubled the duties on Canadian lumber to 18%. As shown in this chart on the right, we saw an unprecedented spike in lumber price last year, and that added $36,000 to an average single-home family in the US. Removal of the lumber duties will save American homebuilders $33 million on the $185 million lumber imports from Canada subject to penalties. This might seem small in the overall context of US import, but the saving is symbolically important. We should also note that as recent as 2017, US imports of lumber from Canada amounted to $5.9 billion and the lumber wars have dramatically reduced US lumber imports while driving up prices. The fourth measure we considered is relaxing the Buy America rules, which exclude foreign competitors from US government procurement. Research shows the US has a markup of 5.6% on its domestic procurement, which translates into about $100 billion cost to US taxpayers. We propose that the government specifies a reasonable margin of preference for US firms when they bid for government work. The rule relaxation would save taxpayers at least $25 billion annually, equivalent to a tariff reduction of 0.9 percentage point on all US goods imports. The fifth measure we considered was capping the US MFN peak tariffs at 10%. Looking at import numbers in 2021, the US imposed MFN tariff above 20% on $21 billion worth of products from countries other than free trade partners. These peak tariffs were mostly hitting clothing, footwear, and dairy products, which are all staples for low-income Americans. Assuming peak tariffs averaging about 30%, a cap of 10% would directly save American households $4 billion or a tariff equivalent reduction of 0.14 percentage points on all US goods imports. The last three measures we considered had relatively smaller effect on inflation reduction, but we still think they're meaningful government work. In the interest of time, I will be brief on them. The generalized system of preferences expired at the end of 2020, and we proposed that when the Congress reenacts this system, it should be liberalized. In particular, the competitive need limit, which is the quantitative ceiling currently in place to limit market access of duty-free products from developing countries, should be waived. And doing so will save American $2.4 billion. In our brief, we also looked at the countervailing duties that US imposes on fertilizer imports from Morocco, a free trade agreement partner. Waiving the 20% duties imposed on Moroccan fertilizers will save the US $140 million. The last measure we considered is waiving the Jones Act for Hawaii and Puerto Rico. By the Jones Act, it is required that ships serving US coastal trade be made in US shipyard and manned by US citizens, making maritime transport the most restricted service sector in the US. Hawaii and Puerto Rico are especially hard hit since all their trade with the continental United States pays the Jones Act tax. Waiving this act will save each Hawaiian family about $1,800 and each family in Puerto Rico about $500. Finally, I will give a quick recap of the measures I just talked about, and in particular, what they mean for inflation reduction. I do want to note that the sensitivity of price level in response to tariff changes differs among different products. As Megan just discussed, if we make the assumption that exports and imports are highly interchangeable, then 1% percentage point of tariff equivalent reduction translates to 0.67 percentage point reduction in inflation. But as we look at more specific cases, we may need to adjust that assumption as well as the coefficient. In fact, our colleague Sherman Robinson and his co-author Karen Thierfelder conducted an exercise in their latest research that explores the scenario where the US only removes these three sets of tariffs I'm showing here on the screen. Together, these removals will result in a combined effect of 1.3 percentage points inflation reduction. And then adding in the effects from the other measures that I just went through, ambitiously, we can actually achieve a 4.2 percentage points tariff equivalent reduction. And that in turn will translate to 2 percentage points inflation reduction. So going to the conclusion, this is basically what I just said, but we do want to add the caveat that these examples are for illustrative purpose, and we realize that the implementation of each of these is going to face strong political pushback. The core message we're trying to send here through these examples is that the US government should find no shortage of potential liberalization measures if President Biden sets their mind to assembling a 2 percentage point tariff equivalent reduction target. And that is our presentation. Thank you for listening.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Yilin. If we could stop sharing screen. Just let me say briefly, I'm picking up on their last point. My colleagues, the co-authors, Gary, Megan, and Yilin, are not tilting at windmills. That's why it's so great to see this study where they say a reasonable number on tariff liberalization, not liberalizing everything to zero, and things that politically are within the power of the Biden administration to do quickly without congressional approval, perhaps congressional pushback, but definitely within executive authority. These are a very practical plan that would have immediate aspects. And as was mentioned with respect to the Jones Act, for example, looking at Hawaii and Puerto Rico, this can be very progressive as well in terms of which poorer states and which poorer communities get the most relief. So I just want to thank our colleagues and say that their full policy brief is out on our website and available widely. The other study that Yilin excellently summarized by Robinson and Thierfelder is also available on the Peterson Institute website. But I now want to turn to Lawrence H. Summers, who is the Charles W. Eliot university professor at Harvard University, and of course has served in a number of senior policymaking roles in the US, including as Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs, Deputy Secretary, and finally Treasury Secretary, as well as Chairman of the, Director of the National Economic Council, as well as Chief Economist of the World Bank. Larry is also, of course, the one of the most distinguished macroeconomists of our day, and importantly for today, along with our colleague Olivier Blanchard, was out in front warning about the inflation risks in the US from economic overheating as a general inflation problem starting roughly a year ago, 14 months ago in January of 2021, which was well ahead of the curve. Larry, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Adam. And you neglected my most important role. I am the vice chairman of the board of directors of the Peterson Institute.
Thank you.
This event highlights for me why I'm proud to be the vice chairman of the board of directors of the Peterson Institute. Peterson Institute has again produced a very important study making a powerful analytical and statistical point with respect to a crucial public policy issue. It occurs to me that this study also may represent another milestone. I think it has been very rare in the history of economic research that the gap between the age of the oldest author of a paper and the age of the youngest author of a paper has been as large as it is on this occasion. And so I compliment Yilin. You don't have a role in that particular statistic, but I compliment both Gary on his longevity and Megan on her precocity. Let me, as a discussant, talk about this paper at several levels. First, is the core estimate that reasonable tariff reduction in the United States could take more than 1% off the CPI a reasonable one? My judgment after reviewing all the statistical machinations is that the answer to that question is decisively yes. The key analytical point that Megan touched on, but that I may be able to say in a slightly easier way for a lay audience, is this. When you reduce tariffs, you have two effects of reducing the price level. One is that people no longer have to pay the tariffs. That's the direct effect. And that's the effect that some previous Peterson Institute work had suggested was relatively limited. The other is that there are people who compete and firms who compete with the tariff good. And so just as if you reduce the price of Pepsi, you force Coca-Cola to reduce its prices. When you reduce the price of imported goods, you reduce the price of domestic goods as well. That turns out to be the larger of the two effects. The indirect effect is, according to these estimates, if I understand them right, on the order of 2 to 3 times the direct effect. And that's because competition is really an important thing. Megan's references to the elasticity of substitution referred to the fact that if you reduce the price of Fords, it has a big effect on GM, but if you reduce the price of tennis rackets, it only has a small effect on the price of golf clubs. It depends upon how substitutable the goods are. These assumptions, you could argue as to whether it was a bit lower or a bit higher, but these assumptions seem to me to be proven based on other work in other areas and to be plausible. Notably, these estimates are in a sense conservative because they are estimates only of first round effects. When you reduce tariffs and reduce prices, it reduces wage demands. And when you reduce wage demands, that leads to subsequent reductions in prices and contributes to further disinflation. I think prudently and appropriately, the authors have left those estimates out, but they could have been added as well. So I think these should be thought of as reasonable, responsible estimates. These estimates meet a test that I always found very important as an economic policymaker, which is you can understand where they came from. It's not, we put all the numbers into the computer and this is what came out. It's basic economic logic, carefully calculated. The second question in evaluating this is the tariff program outlined a reasonable one? Or is this a program of extraordinary and implausible ambition? And I satisfied myself in reviewing the paper that it was a reasonable one in two ways. The first and more obvious of them is by applying my judgment to Yelin's list of specific measures through which it could be derived. The second was by looking at the figures in the paper on the magnitude of the Trump increases. And I thought to myself, probably unreasonable to think we're going to do something as big as 100% reverse the Trump increases, but probably reasonable to think we're going to do something that's as big as reversing 2/3 of the Trump increases, in part by reversing the Trump increases and in part in other ways. So I think the first thing to say is this is a highly credible estimate and that one should believe it and it should be used as a new benchmark in discussions of this issue. Second question I asked myself is the bit greater than 1% increase a plausible one? And, my approach as a policymaker and as someone thinking about economic policy is to take estimates seriously, but not literally. That is to say, I think the authors of this paper believe that what they really know on the basis of their research is something like what I said, bit greater than 1. I'm sure Gary is experienced enough to know that he shouldn't fight for the proposition that it's 1.5 rather than 1.3 or 1.1 rather than 1.3. And I imagine Megan has learned that from her 1.5 years at the Peterson Institute as well. One takes the general indication from estimates like this. So is a bit greater than 1 a lot? Here's some ways of thinking about it. The way the authors suggest is that it's $800 per household. That's a lot of money for many households in this country. That's for a household that consumes 500 gallons of gasoline a year. That's the equivalent of more than $1 a gallon, an increase in the price of gasoline. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is to compare it to other microeconomic measures that are discussed with regards to inflation. One of the things that my late father taught me was that one should only use the term order of magnitude when one actually means a factor of 10, not just if one wants to say that something is important. This is an order of magnitude more significant than anything that can be achieved over the next 2 to 3 years through antitrust action. It is probably 2 orders of magnitude more important than the meatpacking fixation, which has been the subject of several presidential events. And it very substantially exceeds any plausible stake in changing regulatory policy vis-a-vis shipping. So in the sphere of microeconomic measures that might plausibly bear on inflation over the next 2 to 3 years, this is by far the biggest measure available. And it should be seen in that way. By the way, if you ask me for a second biggest measure over the next several years, it would be immigration policy, which has in common the Peterson Institute theme of promoting international integration and globalization. By the standards of that which has been emphasized, this is immensely important. No plausible view, I think the right estimate of the role of manipulation in explaining high gasoline prices is 0. There are others who disagree, but the most extravagant claims for manipulation by oil companies with respect to gasoline prices would not rise to 1/10 of what is at stake here. Third observation that I would make is there are a difficult set of conceptual questions about the role of microeconomic policies versus macroeconomic aggregate demand policies in the explanation of inflation phenomena. And ultimately, the effect of any change like this depends upon what also happens and how the natural behavior of monetary and fiscal policy vary with this. By regarding this as very important research, I don't want to call into question what I'm sure the authors believe, and I'm sure Adam believes, that ultimately what is vastly most important for inflation is macroeconomic policy, is the manipulation of aggregate demand, or to put it, or to use 2 cliches from the economics literature. First, inflation is about the price of goods in terms of paper. And so ultimately it's about the quantity of paper versus the quantity of goods, with doctrinal debates about the role of the money stock versus the role of debt instruments and the like. And second, it's crucial to distinguish between high and rising prices. And that which causes high prices doesn't necessarily cause rising prices. And that's why the authors, careful scholars that they are careful to say this is a 1%, 1+% increase in the price level, which then will, as Adam says, take the edge off of inflation. And they're careful to be conservative in their claims by not taking account of any spiraling impacts. By the way, having been involved in this research, I can attest that they're not ignoring those spiraling effects because it would be too much work and they were lazy. They've actually done careful calculations of those spiraling effects, but they decided that the more prudent course was to be conservative in the estimates that they were providing. Fourth, what's all this say operation? It says that not that for this reason, the United States should immediately and forthwith remove all tariffs without getting anything. Back in the arms control days, it was important to understand that part of what you could get by reducing your stock of weapons was you could get the other guy to reduce their stock of weapons. But there's a big difference between having that insight and having the view that it's better to have as many weapons as you can, and that arms control is something to be avoided. In the same way, the appropriate strategic objective of the United States with respect to trade policy needs to continue to be a more open world, not a more closed world. In addition to the anti-inflationary benefits, the pro-consumer benefits that we will reap from a more anti-inflationary world, we will also get some measure of reciprocity if we are halfway skillful about it, which will serve American economic interests to a further degree. And so this is a fundamentally important insight about the approach that we should be taking in these inflationary times. Finally, let me just reinforce the warnings that have been provided that inflation is a very substantial issue for the United States. Anyone who doubts that inflation is important should ponder that it brought Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, and Margaret Thatcher to power to a very substantial extent. The Fed's current forecast that we will be able to enjoy immaculate disinflation down to the 2% level with consistent unemployment at 3.5%, I think it would be charitable to label it a hope rather than a dream, and absurd to suggest that it is a likely prospect on the current policy path. That is because of the consequence of the combination of excess demand and bad supply shock luck that we have generated in recent years. The key thing that I would advise people to watch is the data on wage inflation. Wage inflation on the most plausible estimates in the most plausible estimates is now running above 6% and has accelerated significantly over the next quarter. If labor markets continue to generate 200,000 jobs a month, let alone 400,000 jobs a month, labor markets will only tighten from their current extremely tight level. That suggests the likelihood of wage acceleration. There are whole economic literatures directed at estimating the relationship between wage inflation and price inflation. I would boil it down to price inflation over time will be about 1% less than wage inflation. And so if we are anywhere near 6 and accelerating, we have a quite substantial problem. We need all the help that we can get in responding to it. The administration should focus on things that are real and important, not on things that are small and inconsequential, like gouging arguments. And that means heeding the result of this important Peterson Institute research.
Thank you very much, Larry. As always, your ability to span between explaining things clearly from first economic principles to wisdom about how to make policy is probably unique, but certainly incredibly valuable. And we're very proud that you're the Peterson Vice Chair, and we're glad that you identified that way. We have collected some questions from registered guests on the chat, or excuse me, on the Q&A function. I'd like to pose them to the group if I may. We just got a statement from Brian Riley that USTR ties prepared comments for Ways and Means Committee today did not refer to consumers, inflation, prices, or free trade a single time. So maybe we could get a little bit more speculation about the political viability of your suggestions. And is there any prioritization about what you think is most likely to go through? Brian rightly reminds us that Adam Smith wrote that there would never be any reduction in tariffs a few decades before Great Britain unilaterally did reduce tariffs. So we never give up hope, but either Larry, Gary, any of you want to say something about political prioritization, how to make this happen?
Look, I think I'd say two things. I think the study that Peterson did some years ago with Fred Bergston having a very major role, calculating that it was over $1 trillion in potential benefits that the United States got from trade in the form of lower prices, was a very, very important one. And I think we just need to keep banging the drum. One way of saying it is that real wages, purchasing power of workers, is wages divided by prices. And you can increase that number by raising the denominator, or you can increase that number by lowering by raising the numerator, or by lowering the denominator, and they're both equally effective. I think it is a shame that we have a USTR office that so consistently reflects a range of special interest political constituencies rather than the general interest in lower prices. One of the things that President Clinton did well was when he spoke about trade, in addition to making the mercantilist arguments for trade, that it would generate more exports and so forth, he also made the David Ricardo arguments for trade about the lower prices and higher standards of living that would result. And this is why studies like this one are so important, that they put these arguments into the air. The political problem is clear, that it's what the late great economist Mansur Olson explained, that some coalitions are easy to form and some coalitions are hard to form. The Coalition for Protection, which is one industry of people who see each other every day, is an easy coalition to form, and therefore they are very influential. The universal set of consumers who don't really understand why it is that the prices they pay are what they are. Both don't see the benefits of trade and find it harder to form a coalition. But ultimately, I do believe that ideas matter, and that explaining and pushing these set of ideas and adapting them to the moment and the moment of concern about inflation is a particularly good moment to be worried about high prices. I think this kind of advocacy over time makes a difference.
Thank you very much, Larry. That's certainly what we believe in. Gary, in slightly younger days, was part, along with Fred and with your stimulation, was part of that big number, leading part. Let me turn to another question. Some of the questions are about the specific conservative assumptions that were made for the reasons that the authors and Larry discussed. So, for example, Debbie Franklin asked about why was Alaska not included when discussing Jones Act? How much would that change things? Anna Veraganoza asks about whether, how much this, to restate her question, how much of this magnitude of this effect could be offset by increased freight costs and shipping costs. So again, just if you could just say a bit more, I don't know if Meg or Yulin wants to do this, but just a bit more about where you think there might be upsides that the impact of your proposed measures might have reasonably have higher impact than what you've put out, or alternatively, how does this set of constructive policies compare to some of the price shocks hitting the US in terms of magnitude? I don't know. Do you guys want to come in on that?
Sure. So in regard to both of these questions, I'm not particularly familiar with the specifics of the Jones Act because I was, Elin and I were trying to figure out more with these calculations that Elin covered in her portion of the presentation. But like liberalization as a whole, and I don't know, Elin and I really have high respect for Sherman and Karen's CGE analysis, and it's economy-wide, and it takes into consideration things like productivity, things like substitution, substitutability, and it looks at it from more of an economy-wide stance. So with our focus, we wanted to go into this policy brief with the goal of just getting the Biden administration and other policymakers on board with trade liberalization, right? Because that's something that's generally not being talked about. And there's other like supply chain issues. Those are predominantly, well, dominating the conversation. So bringing it back to the questions with, I think it was on sea air freight costs. I think Larry touched on this in his discussion, excuse me, Professor Summers touched on this in his discussion, but it just pales in magnitude to lowering tariffs on an economy-wide basis. Like, it's not to say that these things would not lower prices, but just the magnitude, we're looking at two different magnitudes when it's between tariffs or when it's between changing supply chain issues. And as we've seen with China just this past couple of months, shutdowns may be inevitable. There's another wave of COVID coming. Some of these shocks we just really can't foresee, but something that we know would be of benefit to the entire United States economy would be lowering tariffs on an economy-wide basis. Sorry,
that's excellent, Meg.
Okay.
That's exactly the kind of statement of the relative magnitudes I was hoping you could provide. Thank you. Okay. So just to wrap this up, Kathleen Stevenson raises the issue of productivity, and Larry mentioned how you all did work on potential upward spirals, and we didn't include that because of the desire to be very conservative in the sense of not overselling. But just, Gary, you've been at this a long time, and again, this isn't about age, this is about wisdom. What do you think about the dynamic effects of trade? I mean, as Larry has pointed out, again, ahead of the curve about secular stagnation starting in 2016, we've seen a significant decline in trend productivity growth in the US. As I pointed out with colleagues, the US has been withdrawing from globalization for the last 20 years plus. How do you see tariff liberalization and productivity interacting? And Larry may want to come on this as well, but just what the tech speak is dynamic gains from trade. How do you see this playing out?
Thanks, Adam. Yes, as you said, productivity growth has been lagging in the U.S. at least since about 2005, almost 20 years. And trade growth, two-way trade growth by the U.S. has slowed down significantly during this same period. Some time ago, we did a little calculation of the connection between trade growth and productivity growth. There's a lot of micro evidence that when firms are faced with competition, they up their performance. That is, when U.S. firms face competition from imports, they improve their productivity. And in any industry, there's always a spectrum of firms from low productivity to high productivity. And the high productivity firms grow faster when you have this competitive effect. So yes, if you reduce trade barriers, you have a good jolt to productivity in the U.S. economy. And when you have high trade barriers, you don't have much productivity. And going back to the Jones Act, which Megan talked about, this coastal shipping, I mean, there's an industry which is totally insulated from competition by the laws. And the productivity is either zero or negative. It tells the story.
Thank you very much, Gary. Larry, is there an additional point you'd like to make?
Yeah, let me just say a word or two about this, because the questioner is raising something that I should have said but did not say when I was articulating why these estimates are conservative. Think of three parts of the argument. When you take tariffs off, the imports become cheaper for consumers. That's the first effect. The second effect, which the authors emphasize, is that not just does the price of Toyotas get cheaper, the price of Ford's gets cheaper as well, because Ford has to compete with Toyota in order to produce better cars. The third effect, which the questioner is highlighting and Gary just spoke to, is that Ford has to up its game. And in addition to cutting its profit margins, it also has an incentive to innovate. And we all do better when things are being measured and when there's pressure to do better. And that leads to more productivity enhancement. And so in precisely the same way that making an industry more competitive through antitrust policy operates to both reduce prices and over time to increase productivity growth, there's the same effect of greater openness in promoting productivity growth, which also then contributes at a given level of wages to lower inflation. And these estimates should be thought of as conservative because they don't include those kinds of effects. Another way to think about that is, I suggested as a rule of thumb, thinking about productivity and thinking about margins, that price inflation over time would be about 1% less than wage inflation. To the extent that you're successful in spurring productivity growth, that might become 1.5% less, which over time can accumulate quite substantially. But none of this more technical discussion should obscure the really important calculation that's been done here, which illustrates that in the calculus that's got many factors of thinking about trade policy, a meaningful contribution to taking the edge off inflation at a time when that is regarded by the American people as the most serious problem they face, has to be treated as something very important. And I'm grateful to the authors for this important study, to Peterson for being a venue where it can take place, and to you, Adam, for giving me a chance to participate in this discussion.
Thank you, Larry, for stimulating and encouraging not just this work, but our entire research agenda. Thank you to our audience for joining us at this critical time on inflation, when we all have to whip inflation now, but we actually have a way of doing it. And thank you to Gary Huffbauer, Megan Hogan, and Yilin Wang, as well as Sherman Robinson and Karen Theodorfeller, for getting us to these robust, important results. This meeting is adjourned.